Hi, everybody. I'm Virginia Kotz. I'm with Real Progressives. I produce these events at Real Progressives, the various book clubs and webinars and panels. I'm going to turn it over to our dear friend, Tommy John. Go ahead.
Right. Thanks, Virginia. So we have a guest, Yeva Nersisyan, tonight to answer some questions. And I guess if we don't have a volunteer, at some point I'll give a little summary of the chapters. I took some notes, highlighted some stuff, so it'll be kind of stream of consciousness all over the place, but we'll try to summarize the best we can. And what I'll do is I'll introduce our guest now and just give you the info. And then when I'm done, and I'll turn over the mic to her. Yeva Nersisyan is an associate professor of economics at Franklin and Marshall College and a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. She received her BA in economics from Yerevan State University in Armenia and her MA and PhD in economics and mathematics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, or UMKC as it's known around here. Yeva has published a number of papers on topics of interest to MMTers, including a paper she co-authored with Randy Wray with the title, "Are We All MMTers Now? Not So Fast." She actually did an episode of Macro and Cheese about the paper, which I just listened to. It's amazing. Check it out if you haven't. And the chapters we're going over this week are 3, 4, and 5.
Hold on, John. Stephen D. is here. He's the one who volunteered. Stephen?
Go ahead, buddy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry, Tommy John. Looks like I've stolen your thunder there. You looked all ready to get worked up over this.
Take it, buddy. It's yours.
Tell us where you're calling in from, Stephen.
Okay, I'm from Perth in Western Australia.
Great.
And, okay, so chapter 3, can we have too much money? Chapter 1, we're told that money is an IOU from the government. You can always use those dollars to cancel any debt you owe the government, also known as paying your taxes. Because of this, nearly everyone accepts dollars for purchases. And the more money in circulation means more people are owed more goods and services. Now, that's all fine, unless everyone starts demanding their goods and services, also known as spending their money. Why is this? Because there's a limit to the goods and services an economy can produce. And if spending uses up all of those resources, prices will rise and the value of the dollar drops. The author introduces us to the fact that banks can create money by making loans. It's a complex topic. I hope the author expands on it in later chapters. But suffice to say that to control inflation, governments must control lending as well as spending to keep the money in circulation down. I got very little out of chapter 4, but maybe Tommy John might want to say some stuff out of that. Pretty much all I got out of that was the government deficit is balanced by a non-government surplus. And that surplus is the money that's in circulation, which we kind of need. And in chapter 5, we learn that the US government has been in deficit for most of its existence, and that governments don't ever have to actually pay off these debts, and they might be just misnamed. They can just keep paying interest because people will always be looking for these secure investments. That we're told that the debt limit is the capacity to pay that interest, and the governments that borrow in their own currency will always be able to pay that interest because they are able to create money, and that ability to create new money is limited by the capacity of the economy so that you can avoid inflation. Final note I have is that governments tax in order to reduce private spending and free up resources in the economy that they require for public needs, and they can then spend those taxes into those resources. That's all I had.
Nice job, man. I appreciate it. Yeah. Again, real quickly, I think from chapter 3, man, I just think about libertarians, and their idea that the Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and printing money, inflation stuff, it's like, it rarely is it too much money. It's like other factors like productive capacity and things like that. And MMT is not about just endlessly spending money. It's like targeted spending to where, I mean, think if libertarians understood MMT, they wouldn't be libertarians anymore. In chapter 5, the one thing that kind of came out to me is, I guess it's like the whole Phillips curve and the Nairu and there's this natural, I don't know, like area to where we have to have unemployment to keep inflation down. And it's just been accepted as well. It's just, like that invisible market hand, it's something we can't control. We got to try to live with it or whatever. And it's just, that's the beauty of MMT. It simplifies and demystifies a lot of the economic nonsense we've been taught to believe and gives us the answers and shows us that it's just accounting. But either way, I am going to turn the floor over to our guest, Yeva, and I guess let's get her some good questions.
But just before you begin, I would just like to encourage people who are new to MMT to ask their questions. This is not just for people who already know it. It's really most important for those who are struggling to understand it. So please don't be shy. The only way to learn it is to just ask and ask and ask people who can explain it. And so that's why we're doing this. Go ahead, Yeva.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I love fielding questions, that's for sure. I don't think I get enough from my students. And, in academic conferences, most of the time is spent on presentations when I would rather have the interaction with the audience, actually. So just a couple of things that I want to add before we get to the questions. So on the question of too much money, can there be such a thing? I think when people oftentimes talk about too much money, what they have in mind is too much spending, but they don't say it that way. And because they just equate money with spending, right? More money, more spending. But then when you say, well, how did that money enter the economy? Where did it come from? Did it enter through spending? Did it enter from private banks? Did it come from the government, right? So then it opens up all these questions of, if it was created because there was demand for it, how is there too much money, right? So that's one way to think about it. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that when people talk about too much money chasing too few goods, the accurate way to put it would be too much spending chasing too few goods, right? And that's, I think, a point that Randy tries to clarify there. For chapter 4, the main point there is about this idea of imbalances, right? That Randy starts off by saying, well, what's a balance? It's this idea of an ideal state in some sense, right? In economics, we often like to talk about equilibrium, which is the state of balance. There is no sort of reason to move away from that point. And whenever you see a deficit, for example, right, you think of an imbalance. And so there's all these negative connotations associated with a deficit, which is an imbalance, right? What Randy's trying to say is that for every deficit, there is a surplus. So you can't really call that an imbalance, right? So if there is a sector that's in a deficit position, there's a sector that's in a surplus position, they are in that position for a reason, in a sense, right? So similarly, we have a current account deficit with China, right? A lot of economists make a big deal out of it, not just mainstream economists, because we have a deficit, right? But we have a deficit, in some sense, the deficit is good for us and it's good for China. And that's why it's the sustainable position, right? It's not this undesirable position of imbalance that has to be corrected. All right. And from chapter 5, I think one of the key concepts is this idea of a free lunch in economics. We often talk about, well, mainstream economists often say there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? That's very well known. And it's this idea that if the government taxes $1 and then spends it, right? It's not really adding anything new to the economy. It's not really helping the economy. It's just redistributing the use of resources, for instance. And so it's not really creating any value. It's just redistributing it, right? So the government can't just create something, right, out of nothing. So more or less, that's what they're trying to say. So and MMT disposes of that idea, saying that as long as you have unemployed resources, especially labor, then you can put them to work, and that is a free lunch, or at least a very low cost one, right? So I'll stop here and see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, we'll start with Alan Sharples.
Hello from Maui. It's happy hour, Hawaiian Standard Time right now. So I want you to know this is my way of giving back. My question is, why are our politicians, and I don't just mean the US, I think the same applies to Australia from talking to folks, and the UK, why are they so resistant to adopting an MMT perspective? It seems like it would give them something like freedom to do whatever's on their agenda. So just a general question, why are they so resistant?
The $1 trillion question. Well, I've been thinking about this actually recently, thinking that the Democrats are right now losing the debt ceiling fight because they're playing the Republicans' game, right? That during Obama, they were all for balancing the budget, that they passed all sorts of rules for that. With the Deficit Reduction Commission, Social Security cuts were on the table. They just weren't big enough for Republicans and so on. So they're playing this game, right? And it's a losing game. And so if Democrats would say, we're not playing by these rules anymore, instead we're just going to say, this is not how government finances work, right? Come clean with the American people and say, this is how it works. And these are what the real constraints are and so on. And they're not doing it. And it goes back to the question of, or the issue of there just being one party, right? So it's not the Democrat, it's not the Republican, it's the party of business and corporations and so on. So I think they say they want to do things, but it's unclear that they actually want to do them. They will support, like Democrats would say, we want a higher minimum wage. But when it's time for them to do it, when they're in power, they never do it. But then when they're not in power, they can scream that they want a higher minimum wage and they never really do it. So, I mean, political scientists might have a better answer to that, but I mean, that's, I think, what my answer would be.
Absolutely. Our next question is Herb Wiseman. Herb, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm Herb from Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. The speaker, when he was doing his presentation, said something about taxes being spent to obtain resources, I think he said. And that is not my read of the role of taxes by government, that when the government redeems the taxes, they are destroyed. And so I saw that as a bit of a puzzle. And I'm wondering if, Yeva, you could clarify. And by the way, hi again, Yeva. I saw you at the summer seminar.
Right. Yes. Taxes are not used to financing government spending, right? That's not what they do. Instead, the way we should view taxes is as creating non-inflationary space for public spending, right? Because if the private sector produces $100, it creates $100 of income, right? And that income, if all of it is spent, can actually buy all of that output. So if the government wants some of that output to fulfill its public purpose, whatever that is, then they need to find a way to access those resources. Now they can always try to, offer a higher price and bid it away from the private sector, or they could just lower the private sector's ability to purchase some of that output, right? Tax away 20, and that creates then room for $20 of government spending, right? So that's the role of taxes in terms of financing spending. So if there's any way in which you can think of taxes as funding government spending, it would be in terms of real resources, creating that real resource space to then accommodate public spending in a non-inflationary manner. And by the way, if there are any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer those as well.
Up next, we have Wayne McMillan.
Yeah, well, I realize this question is probably a little bit out of our topic today, but I'm wondering, in light of modern monetary theory, do we have an understanding of whether we might be heading into a world recession? And I know this might be hard to predict, but do the signs look like we're heading into a world recession?
Um, it's difficult to say. I think there is a good chance that we are, and obviously, what happens in the U.S. doesn't stay in the U.S. If the U.S. goes into a recession, that's going to have worldwide implications, considering that the world economy is very fragile. There's the problem of the Fed raising interest rates, and it's not just a domestic problem. It's a problem domestically, obviously, that can tip our economy into a recession. Higher interest rates can have two different kinds of impacts. On the one hand, higher interest rates means, higher costs of borrowing. So that can lead to lower spending by businesses, lower spending by consumers, and so on. So that's one aspect of it. The housing market, obviously, is the one that's most affected by this. But then it has ripple effects throughout the economy, right? What happens in the construction sector doesn't just stay there. It's going to then have ripple effects throughout the economy. But then there is also the problem of the Fed raising interest rates and what that means for other parts of the world that have dollar-denominated debts, right? Which might not necessarily be have fixed interest rates. So that could then mean potentially bankruptcies around the world because of higher interest rates. And by the way, the same can happen in the US. It sort of depends how much short-term debt we have, right? So if there's a lot of short-term debt that has to be rolled over at higher interest rates or refinanced at higher interest rates because interest rates are higher now than when the debts were originally taken, then that could have financial implications in the United States economy as well. So it's hard to tell. It sort of depends on the health of the balance sheets, right? That's the issue. And of course, inflation has been eating away at people's real incomes, right? In a way, the way we're fighting inflation, we're saying, well, we don't want you to pay more for food. Instead, we're just going to raise your interest costs. So it doesn't matter how you're giving that money out one way or another, whether it's higher prices or higher interest rates, it's going to be siphoned away from us, right? That's what's going on. So there's a good chance. It's really difficult to say if it's going to happen or not. I think the economy seems to be more resilient than I would have thought, but also it takes a while for interest rate, changes to have an impact in the economy. And I think there is also this drumbeat by the business leaders saying, we're going to go into a recession, we're going to go into a recession. And I'm wondering why they keep saying that, right? Because it doesn't really help them in some sense to create this pessimistic outlook, right? So why are they doing it? Is it going to be, do we need a recession to discipline workers because workers are trying to unionize and so on? Maybe that's where things are going. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it seems that way. Seems a good way to keep workers in precarity. Okay. Anyways, our good friend Bakari. Go ahead, buddy.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I actually have two questions. Probably answered the question that I posted, and I wasn't paying attention because I'm multitasking. Randy Wray says that taxes are government revenue. So I'm not quite sure I understand what he means by government revenue if taxes are kind of destroyed and the government doesn't need taxes to pay for stuff. And so that's question one. And the second question is, why does, like say, the Democratic Party propose that people who earn a certain level of income do not pay any federal income tax at all? So in other words, by people not paying income tax, they were able to keep more money in their pocket and also keep more money in the states. Because it seems like the government doesn't need that tax money. And we see inflation happening and people can't afford to keep up with it. So why not just cut out taxes in a certain level? I mean, certainly not for rich people because they do need to pay taxes, but they absorb a lot of money. But those are the two questions. Thank you.
So on the first question, calling taxes government revenue, I think the reason why we still keep doing that is because revenue is from the French word revenue, which is like returns. So it's returning government IOUs back to the government. So in that sense, right, it's still appropriate to call it revenue, not because it's money that the government is going to spend, right, but it's just the government IOUs that were returned to the government. On the question of tax cuts, right, I think a smart Democratic Party would be the Democratic Party of tax cuts for the poor, right, or lower income or lower middle class people, right? So that could have been, right, the right strategy. But every time there's a question of tax cuts, like payroll taxes, right? Let's give a payroll tax holiday. I think this was getting discussed during COVID. And then you have progressive economists saying, no, we can't do it. Why not? Because payroll taxes fund Social Security, right? If we cut payroll taxes, which disproportionately affect, lower income people, because those on the higher end of the income distribution don't pay as much in payroll taxes, right? Because of the cap, right? So then they say, well, then we're not going to have enough funding for Social Security, right? Because they still have that framework, right? That we need government revenue to spend. And in particular, we need this particular revenue earmarked for Social Security, and we cannot touch it because then the Republicans will come after Social Security and they will say, let's cut it. And they're right. Republicans will do that, right? But that's because you've already accepted their framework. You're already playing by their rules, so you're going to lose. So that's one point. But there is another point here that if you are thinking of taxes as a way to withdraw resources, right? Let's say you're fighting a war, then you can't just rely on taxes on the rich to pay for your war in that sense, right? To create enough resource, to free up enough resources in the economy for fighting a war, like let's say World War II, right? You actually need people who are middle class, who are lower income to cut their spending, right? Because that's where most of the spending in some sense is coming from because of the numbers, right? So then what do you do there, right? On the one hand, for your taxes to actually create room for, say, a Green New Deal, you need to tax those whose consumption will be affected by the taxes, right? If you raise Jeff Bezos' tax rate, they're not going to cut their consumption. So it's really not going to free up as much resources unless you really raise their taxes really high, which I'm not saying we shouldn't do. So there is a reason why there should be taxes on people, but there is alternatives, right? So there's alternatives. You can try to encourage people to save by, say, selling certain kinds of bonds that only, say, lower income people or middle income people can buy and so on, right? With, say, high interest rates, in a way, like you are delaying their consumption rather than confiscating their income and hence permanently lowering it, right? Again, happy to answer follow-ups.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think every congressperson knows MMT. They know how it works. And it seems to me like when you see the FICA tax taken out of your paycheck, it's almost like a reinforcement of this illusion that taxes fund stuff. It'd be bad if a lot of people knew MMT and they understood that taxes don't fund anything, and it would change the whole argument. So maybe it's preventing revolt by keeping that illusion going or something. I totally agree. You could eliminate taxes on working people. Okay. On to Kenny Sabaris.
Excellent. Well done on the last name, by the way. On page 6162, chapter 3, section A, there's a whole section around talking about this fixed price floating quantity, fixed quantity for floating price, the alternatives, two options of spending. And, that's where they talked about freeing resources and stuff. That was just hard to track for me. So if you could maybe recap that and kind of the context of how that's important. And then I'm not sure if this is related or not, but I've heard Warren Rosler in interviews talk about like this government as the price setter. I don't know if these two things are related or not.
Yes, they are sort of related, right? So what Randy is trying to say there is that government spending does not necessarily have to be inflationary, right? Which seems to be the assumption generally. And so he's saying there's two ways you can do more spending, right? If the government wants to buy something, they can say, okay, we're just going to fix the price. And then we're just going to say, this is the price we're offering. We'll just buy whatever quantity is available at this price, right? So in that sense, they don't control the quantity, but they can set the price. And they might end up buying less or more than they might be wanting to buy, right? or perhaps fixing the price is what they're trying to do. But the point here is that you're not inflating the price of whatever you're buying because you're fixing the price. While if you just say, we're going to buy at a floating price, right? So the market determines the price, and instead we just set the quantity, right? In that case, you might end up having inflationary pressures. A good example of this is the job guarantee, right? Because this is an example of the government fixing the price. And this is where Warren Mosler comes, Mosler's point comes into the picture as well, right? Where he says the government fixes the price that it's paying, and in particular for labor, right? Because that's the most important sort of cost in the economy, so to speak. So then you're fixing the price of labor, right? With the job guarantee, you're saying this is the wage, and we're fixing the wage at, say, I don't know, $20 an hour. And then we're willing to buy as much labor as it's available. So then you solve the problem of labor being idle, right? You buy whatever quantity is there, but you're not doing it in an inflationary manner.
So yeah, with the fixed price floating quantity, it just sounds like a standard buffer stock now that you've re-explained it that way.
Right. That's
Like
exactly
how people use it with food and stuff. And then obviously that applies to the job guarantee. Is there any type of buffer stock mechanisms where they do the floating price, where they do the other way? Is that commonly used anywhere in our economies? It sounds like a bad idea, but I'm curious if there's ever any good use for it.
I'm not really sure, but in a way, even if you do it for just one commodity, right, it's possible to inflate the price of that commodity. It doesn't necessarily have to then become a generalized price inflation, unless I guess that commodity is oil, right? But when you're doing it with labor, which is important, right, then the fixed price is, the job guarantee way.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Up next, we have Stephen Cobb. Go ahead, Stephen, whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
Indeed.
Okay. I have a follow-up question, and this is a follow-up to a question that I asked Randy Wray in his initial presentation, and he answered it, and frankly, I didn't understand it well enough. So I'm going to ask you, and here's how I'm thinking at the moment. We all know about the federal government's monopoly power to issue the currency. Article 1, Section 8 makes it very clear that's the only game in town. It's Uncle Sam that's going to issue the currency. Well, now let's focus our attention on commercial banks. And commercial banks find a creditworthy customer, and the guy wants to add equipment to his business or buy a car or whatever. The bank creates a loan. Over time, the customer repays the loan, so it extinguishes the debt. The bank is the creditor, and the guy who gets the loan is the debtor. In the creation of that loan, is the bank, in effect, issuing currency? And if it is it doing it because it has been deputized by the central bank? In other words, the central bank says, we can't deal with all the many loan requests going on all over the economy. So we deputize an individual local commercial bank to issue the currency for us in the form of a loan. Is that the way it works? Or basically, I guess I'm asking about the difference between money and currency.
Right.
So,
I think really it's the difference between currency and IOUs, broadly speaking, right? Because what the bank is technically doing is it's issuing its IOU, right? It's issuing deposits, and they are the bank's IOUs. It was sort of easier to see when banks were issuing bank notes, right? It was clear to see that these were the IOUs of the banks, right? Now, so anybody can issue an IOU. It's not just banks that do it, right? Investment banks do it. Finance companies do it. Households do it, and not financial corporations do it, right? But bank IOUs are special, and the reason they're special is partly the government, right? That the government we have FDIC guarantee, right? That we guarantee that the nominal value of bank IOUs, right, will be fixed. just like the nominal value of currency is fixed, right? So $100 bill in my pocket in nominal terms is the same $100 tomorrow, and it's the same $100 a year from now, right? The same thing with bank deposits. The $100 bank deposit is $100 in nominal terms, right? Not in real terms. In nominal terms, $100 a year from now, and so on. Even if the bank goes bankrupt, that $100 is still nominally $100 because of the FDIC guarantee. So FDIC, which of course comes from the government. There's also the Federal Reserve that stands behind both FDIC, but also behind banks, right? So I mentioned the banknotes, and the banknotes of different banks did not exchange at the same value, right? If you were a small local bank in Missouri, and if I had the banknotes of a small local bank in Missouri and I was in New York and I wanted to spend them, I might need to go to a bank, for example, in New York and try to exchange them for that bank's IOUs. And maybe they would take it and give me a 50% cut, right? They would say for every $100 Missouri bank IOUs you're giving me, I'm only going to give you $50 worth of New York bank IOUs, right? Something like that. So today, when we think of bank deposits, we think of them as the same thing. But in reality, Citibank deposits are Citibank IOUs, right? And it's like Citibank banknotes, and Bank of America deposits are Bank of America IOUs. So it's the same thing. The reason why we think of them as being equivalent is because of the Fed, because the Fed stands behind the banks to make sure that one bank that is owed money by another bank will always get paid, even if they don't have money, right? The Fed will make sure that the bank that's due money will get paid. We didn't have that, right, in that period that I'm talking about with banknotes, because the New York bank didn't know if the Missouri bank could pay them, let's say in gold, right? How would you know if they had enough gold, for example, right? And now that's not a problem because the Fed will make sure that the bank that has to make the payment has enough reserves or has enough central bank IOUs with which to pay the other bank, right? And so that's why we think of the IOUs of a small bank in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as the same as the IOUs of Citibank and JP Morgan Chase, right? Because the central bank makes sure that that's the case. Otherwise, our payment system would be out of whack, right? Like if I had a check written on a small bank in Lancaster and I tried to deposit it in my Bank of America account and they gave me a cut, then that would be a problem. So because of the Fed and FDIC, then we technically view bank IOUs as almost equivalent to US government liabilities because they are convertible on demand. Their value sort of does not depend, their nominal value does not depend on the solvency of the issuing entities, which is not the case for other entities, right? That's why we like to talk about the hierarchy of money, where you had the government that stands at the very top and then banks come right after it. And then you can think of non-bank financial institutions and then, firms and households and so on, right? So that's really that. I mean, again, I'm happy to answer the follow-up questions to that question.
Nice job. All right. Next is my new best friend, Stephen D., who is so gracious to do the chapter summary. Stephen, you want to unmute your mic and ask your question?
I understand now that when buying bonds, a bank swaps its reserves at the Fed for bonds. Just don't understand how this affects the money supply, because every bank customer has the same money in their bank account. Can you elaborate, please?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear the part about money supply. What about the money supply?
Maybe I've misunderstood. I thought the government sold bonds to reduce the money supply, but I don't see how that works.
Oh, how that works. Okay. Right. So, right. So if we're running a deficit, right, then in the United States, the government is mandated to issue bonds dollar for dollar for the deficit, right? But the reality is that what bonds really do is a couple of things, right? And they're related. They withdraw those electronic IOUs that the government created when it spent, right? So they're just changing the portfolio of the private sector, right? So the private sector gets credits to their checking accounts in their bank. So they basically have money now, right? Because as we just said, bank deposits are money. And then the government says, now you have the option of just keeping the money, or you can buy the bonds, right? And the bonds pay interest. And then some people might swap, right, one for the other. So they don't have the money anymore. And instead they have the bonds, right? So that's how it would work. So you have to use your bank deposits from the individual's perspective, right, to pay for the bonds. So then deposits will be minus and the bonds, right, on your balance sheet will be plus, right? So then you can see that money supply technically is going down. And then the next step, right, because process is not done yet, the bank has to make the payments on your behalf to the government, right? And that's going to happen with those electronic entries, which we call reserves, right? Which is like you can think of as the currency in the banking system, right? It's all electronic or mostly electronic. And then so that has to be minus as well, right? That's the second step of that payment process, right? So your deposits get minus, so money supply goes down. The bank reserves get minus because the bank is making a payment on your behalf, right? Then you're going to that's when the transaction will finally be settled. So reserves will go down and then the money supply will go down as well. But the key point here is that why would the government want to do that, right? Why does it make sense for the government to swap one IOU for another? Both of those are IOUs, right? At the end of the day. And the point here is that with the bonds, the government is now offering an interest earning IOU, and hence it establishes a non-zero interest rate. So I have a currency that I use in my classroom, actually. I call them Franklin's because Franklin and Marshall College, and I guess Franklin's kind of works for money, right? And so I tax my students 25 Franklins at the beginning of the semester, and they have to pay me those 25 Franklins at the end. I mean, it shows a bunch of things to them, right? For example, it shows that the worthless piece of paper that I showed them at the beginning of class, right, is not worthless anymore after I impose the tax, right? Now it's worth 2 weeks of their labor, basically. I then show them that each Franklin is worth 1 hour of their labor, more or less, right? Because they have to earn the Franklins through participation, attending lectures, and so on and so forth. But it also shows them that they cannot pay their taxes at the beginning, right? They can only pay taxes after I've bought their services like participation and so on. So they can only pay their taxes at the end of the semester, not at the beginning. But one thing that I also do there is I offer them bonds, right? I say, okay, I'm going to sell bonds, and I do it like it's in the real world, through an auction where the private sector gets to determine the interest rate that they're going to earn in a way. And what that shows them is that if the bonds weren't offered, the interest rate in the economy would be zero because I'm not paying them anything on their checking accounts, right? Once I start offering the bonds, right, then there is an interest rate which is greater than zero. And they can see that I don't need to borrow money from them because that money that they're using to buy the bonds came from me, right? But they can also see that it's for the interest rate purposes, that now the interest rate is non-zero when there are bonds. Now, given that the Fed now pays interest on those accounts that banks have at the Fed, then technically we don't even have to issue bonds to maintain a non-zero interest rate. That's why we could just stop issuing bonds tomorrow, and then we would have no problem of debt ceiling because we would not be issuing debt. But that's another question.
Absolutely. All right. Up next, we have Alan. Alan, go ahead and unmute your mic.
I was looking at the chat and the Q&A, and the questions seem to imply a level of hypocrisy on the part of politicians and neoliberal type economists that I find, is it really as bad as it seems?
You mean is the hypocrisy as bad as it seems? I mean, I've only lived in the US 16 years now. So I don't have that sort of long span of history or that I've lived through to say, okay, this is, how it is. But to me, it seems like it is, right? Because Warren Mosler liked to often say that he would meet with people like politicians or people who work at the Fed and so on. And then they would say, well, okay, we understand what you're saying, but we can't go out and say these things, right? So there is a little bit of that, I suppose, that nobody wants to be that, I guess, trailblazer in some sense. But I feel like there has been enough intellectual space and space created by activists, such as the people who are running this event, where it's okay for politicians to take those risks and say it, right? And they're not doing it. So I don't know. I think hypocrisy is probably a good enough culprit here.
I also don't think it matters. I mean, there's certainly some politicians who just don't understand. We forget MMT is crazy. Everybody knows you need an income in order to afford something. And so we're turning that upside down. So there are definitely people who don't understand, who are genuine, in other words. But so what? Their actions promote austerity, however you look at it. And even if they believe even if they believe the orthodox economists, they are deficit spending anyway. So they're spending all they want on the military or on wars. So they're hypocrites there as well. So either way, it's their actions that, or not their internal feelings or thoughts, that should matter.
Right. And the question about military is an important one. I've been thinking about this question of MMT budgeting, right? Where you need to look at whether a program will be, you say, okay, what do we need? And then only you say, well, how much money do we need to do what we need, right? And I feel like we're already doing that for one part of our economy, and that's the military, right? We're not saying how much tax revenue can we raise for the military. Instead, we say, what do you need? And then we just make it happen. And most of the time, we even add more to what they're requesting, right? So we do have that kind of MMT budgeting. It's just that we only do it for a particular sector of the economy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I personally think every one of these Congress people understands it. And if they don't, they're not qualified for the job. And I think it's more just, it's not in their best interest to stay in power and keep getting donor money to start talking about spending on the public purpose and whatnot. But it's a conversation for a different day. We're going to get to the next question from David. David, go ahead, buddy.
Hi. This is related. My question was, what makes you think that the people, and you've already answered it a little bit, but I want to add, I guess, I don't actually think that a lot of them know. You have to remember, I work in the federal government in one of the federal agencies. Specifically, I work in Small Business Administration. Throughout the pandemic, we had these internal phone calls, big Teams meeting calls where we were talking about what was going on, the disaster loans and all. And every now and then, one of the really senior people, a political appointee, would say something about, and even some of the senior career people. So they, we're stewards of the taxpayers' money, right? Because the SBA guarantees loans. We don't make that many direct loans. And I every now and then, if I got a chance, I would go out on a limb. And I'm protected. I can't get fired. Even if they don't like me, I'm a career appointed person, so they can't fire me. I do my job well. And I'd say, look, no, that's not taxpayer money. And then I would speak MMT without saying MMT. And I would have a whole bunch of people in the chat agreeing with me, going, yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. And yet we have senior people who still don't understand banks create money. They still think this. Because I've also been one-on-one in the room with them in conversation. They don't get it. And some of them are former bankers. And then when you stop and you consider, and I'm saying this just to everybody on the call so you kind of understand, you got to stop and consider who gets into the house right? They're not smart. Some of them might. The Democrats love people with law degrees from the Ivy Leagues to get into the House. They love that. The Republicans love a lot of small business owners, right? Just think of some middle of nowhere district, everywhere is somewhere, but some, low population density state somewhere with some small district, not a lot going on in there economically. Who gets in the Congress? If you're a Republican, you're probably some like local business owner. You're probably doing about 5 million a year in revenue. That's not that much. And, but that's much more than everybody else. And that allows you the luxury of running for office, and you get connected to the Republican Party, you get in. It doesn't mean you know anything. It doesn't mean you know any economics, except the economics you need to know to run some small business. And certainly the Democratic types who, they're all Ivy League people with law degrees from Yale or something, and they don't know anything. Why do we think they know anything? And so I have to disagree that a lot of the people in Congress know this. They don't know it because whatever economics they know, if they didn't do an economics degree, they had a semester or two of neoclassical economics. I find myself giving away Professor Kelton's book. Like I've bought used copies and I give them away. I just give them away. And people come back to me and go, oh, now I understand. Oh, I get it. And I'm just giving it away to bankers who use our loan programs. I give them away to my boss. I give them away to people I meet. I just give the book away without saying MMT. And I say that this is about the economy. Are you worried about interest? People don't know. And you can't assume that because they're in Congress, they know, right? They're not smarter than anybody. They're just someone who either by virtue of having the right law degree from the right university, the Democratic Party likes them, or by virtue of having enough enough cash available from running some small business in a district, a house district somewhere, they now have the leisure and luxury of running for office. And remember, in a lot of these districts, I'm from Southern California, so those district races are expensive. But imagine running for office in the House in like Oklahoma. It doesn't cost anything relatively, right? It doesn't. So just any Yahoo who doesn't know anything can end up in there. And there's room to educate them. And last thing I'll say, someone mentioned that Frank Newman book. By the way, that book's even cheaper than Professor Kelton's. I give that one to the people who I think don't have the attention span to read Kelton's book, right? Because it's really slick. So I've bought dozens of copies. I mean, literally 2 dozen copies I've bought of it and given it away. And people go, oh, I didn't. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, the people in Congress, they don't know. Some of them do, but they don't know. They're no smarter than anyone. They don't know anything. That's my thing.
I completely agree with that, right? The statement that not everyone who's in Congress is smarter, but they do have access to more resources than we do, right? They have staffers, they can, get advisors and so on. And I guess if this was 10 years ago, I would say, sure, I completely agree with you. But that's what I was saying, right? That the MMT is now in the national conversation. In a way, you have a position on it, at least if you've been in Congress for, I don't know, more than a term or two, right? And I guess when I say they understand it, I'm thinking of people like Chuck Schumer. I don't think Chuck Schumer doesn't understand how government finances work, right? And, if he's running the Senate, then Democrats have the House and they're still not doing. So that, those are the kinds of people that I have in mind. I don't mean just like any member of Congress understands this, right? But that's the point, is that MMT is now out there. These ideas are out there, right? So if you are able to access them more so than you could say 10 years ago, like Kelton's book. And that reminded me of when I was a graduate student at UMKC, we were doing these post-Keynesian conferences, and we had Randy Wray's books out there. I guess we were selling them at the conference or something. And then Matt Forstater was there, and we were like, can we leave the table unattended? He's like, yes, it's okay if people steal the books. That's a good thing. Let them steal the books. Understanding Modern Money was the book So yeah, that just reminded me of you giving away the books.
I think a lot of them, or most of them, probably all of them, understand MMT like they understand, I guess, like Marx and class struggle. They're just on the other side of it, I believe. And saying MMT friendly things and public investment is diametrically opposed to what their donors are trying to do. So I think it's all an act. It's all theater for us to argue about, but that is my opinion. And we are going to get on to our next question from Cagley. If you're ready, buddy, go ahead and unmute. You there, buddy?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it. The concept of government debt is actually public sector surplus, could easily be illustrated by looking in your wallet. On the $10 bill that I pulled out of my wallet has printed across the top Federal Reserve note. This represents a debt obligation of the federal government. I can redeem this bill at any time for $10. It is part of the national debt, but it is my asset. If the government paid off all of its debt, I would not have this bill in my wallet. I would be $10 poorer. Could it really be this easy to illustrate what MMT is saying? And that's the question.
Right. So it's difficult for people to understand that their income is somebody else's spending. I try to emphasize that point a lot with my students, right? Because to say, okay, well, from the individual perspective, where do you get your ability to spend, right? And that ability to spend comes from earning income, right? But then at the same time, your income is else's spending. So then it seems like it's a chicken and egg problem, right? That if income comes from spending, but the spending is income, right? Which one comes first and so on. And that's where you can then understand that some kinds of spending are independent of income. So investment is one, but also government spending, right? And that then creates income out of which you can consume, but out of which you can also save. And once you understand that simple idea that at the level of the economy, right, income equals spending, then you say, well, if you divide up people's, if you say, okay, well, let's take the difference between your income and your spending, and that will be your deficit or your surplus, right? Then because income adds up for everyone, right, and it all adds up to spending, then then the sums of all the incomes and minus all the spendings have to add up to zero, right? So I think the sectoral balances, right, it's a very useful tool to explain that government deficits mean private sector surpluses. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking of my students and I'm thinking of all the time that I have in the classroom. And perhaps there's an easier way to do it, right? The point of the dollar, right, in your wallet, I think that's a useful one. What I would say though is that's already, so first of all, we don't count that toward debt, right? You don't count that toward the national debt. So I just want to clarify that only the bonds will count, although technically that's also debt, right? So that's one of the things that you can point out. You say, well, why do we have a debt ceiling for the bonds, but we don't have a ceiling for the dollar bills, for example, right? Or the reserves and so on. So there is that. But that's the debt side of things, right? So it's not the flow of the deficit, but it's the stock of liabilities that are out there, right? Which is related to the flow, right? The positive flow of a deficit leads to a stock of national financial wealth for the private sector and so on. But yes, you could then look at this and say, well, it's a Federal Reserve note, there's a government liability, and it's my asset. Now, the panic right now, right, about the debt ceiling, that illustrates the point very well, right? There's a panic that what happens if the government defaults? What about all the 401ks that have government bonds, right? And so on and so forth. They say, wait a minute, suddenly now the bonds are a good thing, right? Because they're in the 401ks and so on, right? Then you see, right, that it's that it's in somebody's 401k and it's not the national debt, right? So, right, the current panic over that, I think it's very illuminating.
Absolutely. All right. Next up, we have my comrade from another momrade, Jeffrey Ginter. Go ahead, buddy.
How you doing, Yeva? Nice to see you again. May the force be with you.
There's two things that I just, every now and again, I like to get things front and center because I think people just need to hear it. So if you could talk about two different things, what is the law or rule? When was it done and under whose authority? The relic of the gold standard, stating that bond sales must equal deficit spending. If we could talk a little bit about that. And second, what is the law or rule that forces the CBO to tell Congress about how budgets will affect the deficit, almost to the exclusion of just about anything else? When did that take place?
Yeah. I'm not sure about the first one. I want to say from the beginning, whenever we've had to run deficits, which was usually war related, but don't quote me on that. So I don't know when we made it a rule that the deficits have to be paid for by government bonds. And I guess I should know this. I should make a note to myself. The second one, the CBO was created for that purpose, right? At least that's my understanding, that CBO was created to score, right, the spending programs, right, according to how much they would be adding to the deficit. So it's not like the CBO was there and then they decided to do this as well. I think it was created for that purpose. And I'm going to quickly Google when CBO was established, because I think it might be related to that. No, it's not related to the 87 thing. So it was established in 1974. Yeah. So that's what I think. That's my understanding of where the CBO and the scoring comes from. I think CBO was created for that purpose.
Right. Our next question is from Ditya Paul. Go ahead and unmute your mic, buddy.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Yeva. Thanks for doing this. And I just want to say I've also appreciated a lot of the content you put out on RP. I learned a lot. So I have a question in the similar theme of the recent ones here. So, I mean, especially now with debt ceiling, there's been sort of this resurgent discussion about mint the coin. I've also heard other people, including Warren and John Carney, discuss the possibility of running overdraft accounts at the Fed, which to me personally, not that that means anything, is actually a more appealing option in some ways and achieve the same kind of political outcome. Can I just ask you then, in your opinion, putting you on the spot a little bit, is there any compelling argument for or against this idea? An overdraft account, perhaps there's some law that's related.
Yes.
And is there any reason this idea hasn't really gained as much traction as mint the coin, for example?
Well, so I think the reason why the mint the coin has been advocated for by people like Rohan Gray and others is because you don't need to change any rules for you to be able to do it. You're just using a loophole in existing legislation to do something. I wrote a short piece, and I don't know if it will ever see the light of day, but I basically said, Janet Yellen is right. The coin is a gimmick, because that's what she said it is. But I said, so is the debt ceiling, right? It's like one gimmick to overcome another gimmick, right? In a way, you have the self-imposed constraints and then you're trying to find a way out of them. And you say, here is a loophole, right? So in a way, if the debt ceiling is sort of legitimate, right? Then so is the coin in that sense. It's the same thing. So that's why the coin, right? It's not that the coin is the preferred alternative. It's just that the coin can be done without needing for Congress to make any changes, because Congress is not going to make those changes, right? Now, ideally, we should have an overdraft facility, right, at the Fed, where the government can just use, and then it doesn't have to issue bonds dollar for dollar. It can still choose to issue bonds. It can approach them in a functional manner, right? Do we need more bonds for pension funds and insurance companies and so on, right? Do we need more of those, for instance? Given the kind of pension system we have, right? We might need to keep that, and then we can just issue them. Do we need to issue more short-term treasury bills? Do we need to issue longer term, so we can sort of approach that whole bond issue more functionally, right? Depending on the needs of the economy for treasury securities, and then and then leave aside the question of budget deficits, right? And then if we have the overdraft facility, then we can do that, right? So basically use the overdraft facility unless you also want to you want to issue the bonds for a particular reason, for instance, although you can, I guess, do both at the same time. They're not contradictory. Now, we did have the option of the Treasury having a line of credit at the Fed until it was either 1973 or 1978 when that was eliminated. Okay. I don't remember the legislation that eliminated that, but until then we had that possibility. Now, it didn't mean that the Treasury could just spend without issuing bonds, right? There was a limit to that line, but it was still there, and it's not there anymore. Now, Bank of England, right? The Treasury there in the UK has a line of credit to Bank of England. They actually tapped that line of credit during COVID, right? And there was a lot of a lot was written about that at the time, right? That they're printing money to finance the government spending. Why are they doing that, and so on? If I'm not mistaken, in Canada they have that as well, right? So there is no reason why we cannot resurrect something like that. But the problem is that Congress has to actually decide on that. And if Congress is not going to agree to raise the debt ceiling, then there is no chance that they are going to make these kinds of changes, right?
Yep. Tyrone, whenever you're ready, buddy, go ahead.
Sure. My question was kind of inspired by the SBA guy's comments. And I was wondering, I guess, what you would say about collateral requirements for banks, and particularly when government backs loans. It seems like the effect, particularly on like small business SBA loans or guaranteed loans, you end up getting a wealth test, which means fewer people of color, fewer women, fewer people with low income backgrounds or not high income backgrounds get filtered out of the potential creating a business, building affordable housing, doing anything other than working with earned labor.
Right. And I think that's one of the issues that Randy discusses in chapter 3 when he talks about the private money creation by banks, right? So when people talk about bank money creation, sometimes they will say the bank creates money out of thin air. I think that's not exactly correct. It doesn't create it out of thin air. It creates it by accepting the IOU of somebody, right? Whether it's a household or whether it's a business, right? So then the question of, say, bank health, right, is about the IOUs that it's accepting in the process of issuing these deposits, right? If they're accepting good quality IOUs, then they will be healthier and so on and so forth, right? But what Randy says there correctly is that we have this free market approach, right? So we have banks that they're subsidized in a sense, right? They have all these public guarantees, but then we allow them to sort of direct society's resources how they see fit, right? With very limited exceptions. We can definitely do more of that, right? So a lot of MMTers, for example, support credit controls, for instance, right? Which can restrict some of that certain kinds of lending, right? That you don't want, which can prevent asset price bubbles because you're not sending so much credit into one particular area. You can do it on the other side as well, right? You could say, we do want to prioritize certain kinds of lending, right? We have the Community Reinvestment Act, which is supposed to do that to some extent, right? That banks have to make certain kinds of loans and reinvest in communities and so on. It seems to not have been super successful, so we can definitely try to beef that up, right? And make sure that everyone has access to credit. Because I think once you understand that money is not a scarce resource, right? Finance is not a scarce resource, then it opens up the possibilities for all sorts of positive change, right? The problem is that it's very difficult to win when you have the power structure that's set up in a way to not want you to make those positive choices, right? I mean, but changes, not choices. Yeah.
All right. Our next question is going to be read by Virginia from Greg Roast, who I imagine is laying on a pile of goats and he cannot ask his question right now.
He's probably milking the goats right now.
Right.
But Greg is one of our most valued writers at Real Progressives. He says, could Yeva please provide some insights on the Saudi principle? That sounds British, doesn't it? You sod. On the Saudi principle, page 80, how compound interest on debt outpaces growth. Our present path of asset inflation and wave deflation. How might a debt jubilee unfold? Uncle Sam can roll over the debt forever. So without policies such as ZIRP, that's zero interest rate policy, without policies such as ZIRP, inequality could, in theory, get worse forever. We can't spend our way to equality without first canceling some of the inequality. That's a question. Is this our situation? Please connect some dots for me.
Right. So I think it's the idea that if you have an interest rate, right, that is higher than the growth rate of income, then it means your debt will become unsustainable. Because if your income is not growing sufficiently to at least cover the interest, right, then it means you're not paying down the principal. And in fact, you could be adding to the principal. So in some sense, you become a kind of a Ponzi, right? And you have the Ponzi position in that Minskian terminology, right? And so that's not going to be sustainable. Now, so a lot of economists, like people like Jim Baker, right, say, how come people aren't appreciating the kind of economy we have? It's a very good economy. And I think, okay, if you look at it in a vacuum, you would say, this is a good economy, relatively speaking, right? The unemployment rate is low, for example, and so on. But then, at least compared to the previous recoveries that we've had, which have been very jobless and sort of dragged out. But at the same time, you say, well, you can't look at it in a vacuum, right? There is all of this past 40 years where wages have not grown, right, in real terms, where inequality has been a problem, where we have the problem with student loans because education has been unaffordable for most people. The housing prices, right? We've had inflation in asset prices for many, many years now. And obviously the ones who own the assets are the ones who are benefiting from this inflation, while the rest of the people who are trying to buy some of these assets like homes are not able to. So yeah, that's sort of the context within which people look at the current economy and they say, it's not working for me, right? Because it has not been working for quite some time. It's not just about the current sort of point in time. It's not just about that. The point is that macroeconomic, and I mean, politically, right? How much more can people take? I don't really know. I think I'm constantly amazed at how much more they take, right? Without being on the street, especially in the United States. They are on the streets in France for their retirement stuff. But macroeconomically, right? If the debt becomes too unsustainable, it's not going to. A process that is unsustainable by definition cannot be sustained, and therefore will have to have an end, right? So if the private sector becomes too indebted, for instance, then that's definitely going to be a problem. And so to the extent that inequality can have that sort of breaking point, right? It could be that. Macroeconomically speaking, politically, I don't really know.
I'd like to make a comment about the difference between the reality and the rules. And think about, I think about when people use the word debt. Well, are they talking about the national debt or personal debt? It can get very confusing. And the same is true with the rules about deficits, for example. You know, Stephanie Kelton uses that analogy of the scorekeepers at a sporting event, and the scorekeeper never runs out of points. But on the other hand, there are some games like tennis where it can only go to a certain, the game's over once you reach, 15 points or something. And so then you can say the scorekeeper ran out of points. I mean, in theory, they could play forever, but once they reach a certain number of points, it's over. And I'm sort of feeling like that's the issue with deficit spending, because if you say we can't have new programs without income for them, without raising taxes, that's true. It's a rule, but it's not literally true. So I don't know if this is a question, but it's certainly something that I've been thinking about.
Right. I mean, there are all these self-imposed rules that tell us what we can't do and what we can't have, right? In some sense. So in a way, it's like they do have that bias of not doing things, right? Rather than the bias of doing things instead. So yeah, I guess we are playing the game of tennis in some sense. That's a good analogy.
Right. Yeah. And we've somehow been taught that we have this economy we have to support, this fragile economy. And there's nothing about actually supporting the people. The people have to worry about protecting the economy. So our last question is from Herb, who wants to weigh in on an earlier question. So go ahead and unmute, Herb.
I wanted to address the issue about politicians again and why they do or don't do things according to MMT. And I did write it in the chat, but I don't know if you're recording that or keeping track of that. There is a book called Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean. And the subheading is the radical rights stealth plan for America. And it documents the history of neoliberalism and libertarianism, mostly libertarianism, from the mid-50s, the Brown versus the school board case, moving on from there to the present, and all the various things that were happening in order to put libertarian thought in dominance. And I wanted to make a comment because we had the chapter Balances, and the thought that I'd had around that was that we have a strong push by the libertarian sect trying to diminish our personal responsibilities, our social responsibilities to each other in favor of individual rights and capitalism, commie. There you are, commie. And I think that that's a real important aspect. The final thing I was going to say is that there was an excellent article written in Skeptical Inquirer in the year 2000, November-December issue, called Why Bad Beliefs Don't Die. And I think that's relevant to the Congress members who have these beliefs. They come in with these beliefs and they don't change them very easily because it's actually tied in with their belief in the libertarian project, and it's tied into their other beliefs about how their brain sees the world surviving. So those are all complex issues that I see as being a very systematic or systems-oriented way of looking at these things. So to bring about the social change we need to have a systems orientation, and it gets really complicated. I just wanted to make that comment for people, but I recommend the book Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean. It's probably one of the most important books for people to read after the MMT ones. Thank you.
Let's see, David, you want to unmute your mic?
Yeah. Hi. Sorry. 2 questions. I hope I don't take time from anyone. I'll make it fast. I've been wondering about this since I moved to DC 4.5 years ago to work in the SVA. And I thought, oh, sure, I'm going to get to go, when I was sort of excited in a nerdy way, like, oh, I'm going to get to go to all these seminars by these think tanks that are sort of left of center, right? And like Roosevelt Institute, the Economic Policy Institute, Center for Budget Policy Priorities, that sort of thing. They're all kind of center left, little bit left of center and stuff. I thought, well, surely they're going to talk about MMT. Not a damn one does. Like, I mean, like if you say the word MMT, and I've done this, if you say MMT at any one of these little things that they have in the middle of the day or in the evening after work, and it's easy for me to go because I'm in DC. If I say MMT, it's like I farted at the dinner table. And I don't like, and I think these should be the people, they're all supposedly heterodox economists there. these are I've not understood this, and I'm wondering if the professor on the line has any idea, because I don't know the answer. I really wonder, why are these leftist center think tanks just not even on board with this knowledge?
Yeah. And David, were you at the summer school at Levy this summer?
I was. I saw you
Okay.
there. Yes,
Yeah,
I
your
remember.
name
You're.
sounds familiar. Yeah. That's very
It
good.
was mind blowing. It was life changing.
Glad to hear that. That's a very good question. Some of the earliest people, so the conference I mentioned in 2006 was the post-Keynesian conference. So some of the very
Right.
first people that MMTers were trying to engage with were the post-Keynesians. Like, we're just continuing the same Keynesian logic, right? In a sense, you're saying, okay, so spending creates income, fine. Loans create deposits, fine. But then when you say government spending, that creates the income with which taxes can be paid. No, that's where it's so weird that you're thinking it's such a fit with the Keynesian logic, right? That the opposite, like this idea that the government borrows from this sort of pool of money that is sort of limited and so on. And therefore we have to watch how much we're spending and match it with tax revenue and so on. It's very bizarre. And I don't really know why. I mean, it's like, the heterodoxy, I guess, likes to think of itself like as if they're thinking outside the box and they are open to non-traditional ideas. But I guess they themselves are mainstream in their own way, in the way that that's the way things work, and they know it, right? And they are not willing to entertain other ideas. And in some sense, they are even more, I think, dogmatic sometimes than the mainstream, because they understand their heterodoxy in opposition to the mainstream. So they already have that critical thinking about the mainstream, and they are sure 100% that what they know is the right way, right? So yeah, I mean, a lot of the critiques of MMT have been coming from what you would call heterodox economists, right? Post-Keynesian Marxists and so on. There's that post-Keynesian listserv that's run by people from the UK, and the UK is undergoing potentially another round of austerity, right? And I mean, their economy is in a very bad shape because of all the austerity that has already happened. And yet you have this so-called post-Keynesians in the UK who are writing a letter where they're basically saying, we need to raise the taxes for the rich so that we don't have to cut the spending. Once you already work within that framework, then you've lost. You can't adopt that framing. And like an MMT economist sent an email and said, well, you should not be framing it in terms of taxes pay for spending. And they said, no, it's basically like, if you don't do it, you're not going to be taken seriously, right? It's this idea that to be considered, to be taken seriously, you have to work within this framework, right? I mean, I was at a conference with Bob Poland, who was sitting right next to me, and I presented my paper on the Green New Deal, basically arguing that it's not a money question, it's a resource question, that you have to do a resource accounting and so on. And he says, yeah, but you still have to structure the financing. Like, you still have to have a way, like you still have to say how much will be taxes, how much will be bonds, green bonds, red bonds, whatever. You have to have all of that. Otherwise, your proposal will not be taken seriously. And that's such a shame.
Yeah. And I think it would be a hell of a lot harder to push austerity measures if people understood MMT. If they realized that money wasn't scarce and that we don't have to worry about the budget, it'd be a lot harder to convince folks that, we have to do this. We got to eat our peas and stuff. But geez, it's such a mess. All right. We have two more questions. I think we're going to wrap up. Betty, are you ready?
Yeah. Am I on?
You are. Go ahead.
Yeah. It worries me that even with MMT, which I think is great, doesn't the economy have to keep growing and expanding? And isn't that going to be a basic problem?
Right. For the environment, I suppose, is
Yeah.
the question. Right. So I think growth for the sake of growth is definitely a problem, right? At the same time, we can't say we have to stop growing our economy because there are still people who don't have enough, who are poor. Now, we could say that some of it is a distribution question for sure, right? I mean, in case of the US, we probably could do what Keynes said could be doing, which is like smell roses and watch ballet and so on, because we are productive enough where if we, with the right distribution, then we wouldn't have to worry about it, right? But I think worldwide, we're not at that point yet, probably, where all of our sort of needs could be satisfied with the size of our current economy. So in a way, there still has to be some growth, right? The question is, how do you do it in a manner that doesn't destroy your habitat as humans, right? So that's the important thing that we have to consider. And I think the MMT approach then allows you to say, okay, well, how do you do it? Like, how do you transition to, say, a greener economy? How do you transition to a more sustainable economy? And obviously, the big thing you can do for this is to lower the amount of inputs you need for the same output, right? Which then means raise your productivity, for example, right? So if we can be more productive, then we can use less resources to try to get the same kind of output. And to accomplish that, then you need more investment, right? More investment in research and development and so on, sort of more money being thrown at this problem, which you can do. I think with COVID, we saw how much the government can accomplish if it's willing to throw a sufficient amount of money, right? Like, why haven't we still cured cancer, right? We're doing fundraisers to raise money for this and that, when money is the least of our problems. If we have the resources to tackle those issues, right, then we can fund them. And we clearly, if we're doing this stuff, then we have the resources and so on. So that's the whole thing. But there is a question of, the news has been replete of stories about the robots taking our jobs, right? AI, chat GPT is coming for our knowledge workers and so on and so forth, right? So in that sense, it seems like productivity is not going to be our problem, right? That we are going to be sufficiently productive. So if all of the robots are producing all of the output, right, then you could say that's a great thing, right? Then people can smell the roses and watch ballet and so on, like Keynes says in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. But then the question is the distribution, right? Who decides who gets how much of what the robots are going to produce, right? Who decides who gets how much? And that's the real issue at that point. And so the problem is not the robots, right? The problem is that robots can be the solution, actually. And Randy sort of mentions that in the book as well. The problem is, what do we do once we have the robots producing everything, right? What do we do with the rest of us, right? In some sense. So yeah, I would say lowering the amount of inputs we need for the same output, and obviously tackling the question of distribution, right? To make sure that we can satisfy people's needs with whatever we're producing. And of course, that then involves dealing with the problem of rich people gorging up the society's resources, right? Much, much more disproportionately. I don't know how you tackle that power, though, because they're not accumulating money for the sake of the resources. They're really doing it for power, and power is what they have, and power is what they use to stay in power.
Yeah, it's the problem with how things are organized now, like the automation and the robots, I guess the productivity and the surplus created by them, like the capitalists want to own that. And then it's like workers, you got to find another job. The robot put you out of a job, when realistically automation and technology should benefit all of us and give us more vacation time, kind of thing.
Right. But at the end of the day, if robots are doing all of our jobs, who are they selling the output to? How are, so there has to be some kind of income. So that's where this idea of universal basic income, right? It seems so attractive and so on. So, and we'll just throw the crumbs to the people, and I guess, yeah.
I actually want to make a comment first. People are talking about the quality of public school education. I'm a lot older than most people here. And I remember a time when the public schools were amazing. They were well-financed. Well, not all of them in the U.S., let's face it. But it was during the space race and the Cold War. And, Kennedy talked about getting to the moon before the Russians. So they were gearing us up to be good, computer programmers, technicians. They wanted us to all understand that. I went to a public school. I was like 12 years old. They started teaching us the binary system. They started teaching us to think that way. I didn't know what a computer was. Yeah. Anyway, you have an early class tomorrow. Yeah, but let me just read Christina's question, and then that'll be it. And Kenny, you'll have to bring yours next week. Christina asks, what would a sound public sovereign wealth fund look like? And is there such a thing?
Yeah, I can't see a reason for having it, why we need a sovereign wealth fund. In some sense, it only makes for countries that are not the US to have a sovereign wealth fund, because then they have their say oil revenue that they put in a fund, and then so the money they earn from us, then they put it in our stock market, which then it's part of what Minsky calls the money manager capitalism, right? It's part of the managed money that flows into assets and inflates the price of assets, which is not necessarily very helpful. So recently, the person who wrote, "How are you going to pay for it?" which I guess was, ripping off MMT a little bit. I don't know the name, but he was being interviewed about Social Security, and his proposal was the government should issue bonds and then raise that revenue and then invest it in the stock market. I just couldn't, seriously? So that's the grant's plan to save Social Security, right? We're just going to add more money into Wall Street. We're going to send more money towards Wall Street. That's our good plan. I mean, Germany wanted to do something similar. I gave a talk to a German group over the summer where they wanted to take, I don't know, it was $100 billion, so not too much, and basically invested in the US stock market, more or less. I mean, they said international, but I think the point was to invest it in US stock markets and then to earn the money so that they could afford to pay their retirees, which makes no sense, right? So the point is that if you are a sovereign government, there is no way for you to save in your own currency, right? Because you can't save your own IOUs, right? The Franklins that I mentioned, I don't save them from one semester to the next. I don't need to invest them in the stock market to earn returns so I can pay my students next semester. It just doesn't work that way. Now, if you're Norway or if you're Saudi Arabia and you have a lot of oil money, which is in dollars, so it's a claim on the United States, then it kind of makes sense for you to do it. Is it a good thing? Not necessarily, to the extent that it contributes to asset price inflation.
Man, this has been real informative. Thank you for your time. Wrapping up next week with the finale with chapters 6 and 7. And the man himself, the author of the book, Randy Wray, will be joining us to answer all your questions.
Yeah, but thank you so much for stepping up and helping us once again.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Yeah, and thanks to everyone, and thanks for the good questions. Yeah, I'll try to join Randy's, when Randy's doing the webinar next time. So.
Good night, all.
Cool. Good night, everyone. Take care.